Hi, I'm Dean Baquet. I'm the executive editor of the New York Times. I'm here to answer your questions about the presidential election, the New York Times, media in general. I'm in Cleveland for the Republican convention, and I would love to have some questions. I can talk a little bit about how different I suspect this convention is going to be than the Democratic convention. There was a large narrative to this convention, and I thought you saw it play out remarkably last night. The narrative was how would Donald Trump be able to pull together all the forces and unite a party that went through such a contentious convention. And I think we saw that very much on display and his difficulty in doing that last night. I think the Democratic convention will have a little bit less of a narrative. Hillary Clinton will announce her vice presidential running mate before, and I think Bernie Sanders already endorsed her, so I think there's just going to be a lot less drama that'll still be compelling. And I think that's the largest difference between the two. But I'd love questions. I'd love questions about the Times. I'd love questions about politics. And I'm open for business. So the first question is, I think Leroy Mora asks, did Ted Cruz commit political suicide last night? You know, I'm not sure. I was actually in the arena, and there was this dramatic transformation of the crowd. At one point you felt like, God, this guy has everybody eaten out of his hands. And then all of a sudden in that last few minutes the booing started. But you could read it two ways. If Donald Trump loses, Ted Cruz could come across as the one guy who sort of stood up to him. If Donald Trump wins, I think he's going to have a rough time in the Senate. And then Stephen Smith asks, why aren't you as critical of Hillary? I think the Times has actually been pretty critical of Hillary Clinton on its editorial pages. And in my conversations with the people in the Clinton campaign, they think we've been too tough on them in news coverage. I actually get this a lot. Why are we too tough on Hillary Clinton? Why are we too tough on Bernie Sanders? Why are we too tough on Donald Trump? And I think if each candidate asks that question, it probably means you're being fair. Kathleen O'Donnell asks, do I believe that Gary Johnson will be invited to participate in the debates? I suspect not. I suspect he won't have the threshold to be invited. I don't think it would make, well, would it make a difference? It would make great television. But I suspect the eyes of the country, no matter what one thinks of Johnson and no matter what one thinks of the two leading candidates, the eyes of the country between now and the election will be on those two candidates. More questions? Come on. Too easy. More? So why don't I just talk about press coverage of the campaign, if you'd like. The next few months, as we cover these two candidates, will be pretty dramatic, obviously. I think Donald Trump is particularly difficult to cover. On the one hand, he loves the press. He calls us, he talks to us, he's more visible than almost any other candidate that I've seen in years. On the other hand, he likes to beat us up publicly. Hillary Clinton, people know a whole lot about, so bringing her to life as a candidate is really difficult because there have been books about her, etc., etc. Here we go, here's a question. Ken Verve asks, how much longer does print media really have to live? I actually think print media will be around for a long time. I think that the phone is just a huge transformation in the way the media is delivered. For somebody of my generation to be able to show live video like this on our website, to make that available to readers, is great. But I actually think that I think print's going to be around for quite some time because there's still advantages it has in its presentation that the phone and others don't have. Certainly within my remaining time as editor. So Nick Lennon asks, when is the Sulzberger New York Times going to disclose its financial and political conflicts of interest? Actually, there really aren't any. The Sulzberger family's financial conflicts of interest are deeply embedded in its ownership of the New York Times. They really don't have much other financial interest, which makes them different from other publishers. So why not more fact checks than opinions? We actually publish more fact checks than opinions. I don't run the opinion side of the New York Times, I run the news side of the New York Times. And we actually publish a huge number of fact checks. We fact checked every live speech. We have a whole fact check operation running throughout the campaign. So it's pretty extensive fact checking. More stuff? Okay. Joshua Jones asks, what issues do I think will actually decide the election between the two candidates? My gut, the economy, and we actually don't know what the economy is going to look like in November, and I think foreign policy. I think that Hillary Clinton is running on the notion that she is wiser and more experienced in foreign policy, and Donald Trump has far less experience. So I think those are going to be the issues that will dominate the next couple months. Robert Van Sickle asks, how does this year's RNC compare in tone to those in the past that have been televised? Every journalist I've asked over the last few days about the tone of this RNC convention has said it's been more negative. I mean, that's not a new thought. I think that the focus of the last few days has really been on Hillary Clinton. And I think everybody thinks it's been there's been a sharper, harder edged tone to this RNC convention than others in the past. Jay Javeri asks whether I think America is moving farther away from the two parties and closer to independence. I actually don't think so. I think the reality is more people voted. I mean, Bernie Sanders ran as a Democrat. More people of all economic stripes and age groups voted for candidates and voted for major candidates, so I don't think so. So what do Americans think about Brexit? Nicholas Garcia asks. I don't think most Americans are focused enough on Brexit. I think Brexit will have a huge impact on the economy. One of the things we've tried to do at the Times is devote a lot of energy and a lot of resources and our whole European operation to covering Brexit, because I think it'll cover trade, it'll have a huge impact on the American economy and even foreign policy. Ed Prentice asks, so these are good, why does the media give equal weight to opposing views where one side lacks factual support? I actually think that's a fair criticism of us sometimes. I think sometimes we do a little bit too much on the one hand, on the other hand, and not enough just calling it when one candidate is wrong. I think we've gotten better at that. I think that we've gotten more conversational and we've just gotten more direct in saying when somebody's wrong, but I think we can do it more. Monir Madison Ubara, who's an American Muslim, asks a very powerful question. That's probably a question that people should contemplate as we continue the debate in the coming months. He's afraid of having his kids targeted because they're Muslims. I won't address the point of Newt Gingrich's comments, but I will say there was a little bit of a shift in the hall last night where you could see Ted Cruz and others say that we have to be careful as a country that not everybody who's Muslim is targeted as a member of ISIS, which would go against obviously all American values. But I think one of our jobs as the press is to actually hold government to account and to ask tough questions to make sure the government doesn't go too far in pushing its agenda when the country is at a fearful moment. Ivan Pale asked a question, and I have no idea what the answer is, which is, who will Hillary Clinton choose for a running mate? You know this weekend, and I have no idea. Gail Taylor asks, what's the most pressing issue the presidential candidates must address? You know, I'm not sure there's one. I think there's a lot. I think that people are nervous about their safety. I think people feel, and all the polls show this, that in the last several months especially, there's been evidence of a very powerful divide in the country between rich and poor, black and white. And I think people will expect these two candidates to talk about that and address that in a specific way, and we'll be looking for their answers. So any advice for undergraduates on how to filter the massive amounts of editorial content versus straight reporting? You should probably only read the New York Times. I think that would be my primary suggestion. Actually, You know, I think that schools can do a lot to teach people the difference between opinion and straight news. I mean, to me, it's evident because I grew up in that world, but I actually think that should be part of a curriculum in schools across the country. Sarah Ober, how do I think we got here? You know, I think that her question, which is provocative, how did we get to the point where each party has nominated someone with very high negatives? I think that Donald Trump's nomination is the result of a party that obviously is struggling to figure out how to respond to Democrats controlling the White House for 8 years. I think he was a compelling candidate. I think he's obviously a hugely articulate, dramatic presence. And I think Hillary Clinton is an experienced politician who has a lot of support. And even though they both have high negatives, that may as much be a reflection of the mood of the country as it is them in particular. Andrew Dyer, do you think the media is too concerned with performances at the RNC rather than the policy positions of the ticket? You know, I actually don't. It is sort of a performance, right? I mean, it is an instance in which the country gets a first look not only at the standard bearers, but the young up-and-coming talent. It gets a look at governors and mayors and senators. So there's a performance quality to it. But I would argue that the New York Times in particular, but the press in general, has really struggled with issues like the economy, Brexit, national security. I think we've worked quite hard at that. John Drake, what do you think history will say about how America handled the racial strife of the summer of 2016? That's a really difficult question. I think that I would say a couple things. First, America did not erupt as a nation the way it did in the 1960s. I think history will try to, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think history will have to grapple with that question. I think probably America, it may not seem this way to people in the middle of all this. I think America is not quite as explosive and in quite as explosive an environment as it was in 1968. How should people filter the disinformation being spread through spontaneous social media memes? I actually think this is a fabulously important time for media. I always tell the story that when I was a kid growing up in New Orleans, I only had one way to get media: 2 local newspapers, 3 local television stations. Now if I want to, I can read social media from anywhere in the world. I can read The Guardian. I can sort of search the world for different information, for different, just different perspectives on the world. So whatever price we pay for this dramatic increase in social media, I think what we've gotten out of it is important, which is we have gotten the ability to understand the world better, read different opinions, and just sort of read just much more about what's going on all across the world. Vicky French asks, what are we expecting from the DNC next week? It will be, first off, one of Barack Obama's last moments to step back and give a dramatic farewell speech to his party. It will be Bernie Sanders' moment to probably do what Ted Cruz wasn't able to do, which is to embrace the person who beat him. It'll also be a moment where we get to see whether Bernie Sanders is going to encourage his younger constituents to support Hillary Clinton. It's a moment where the whole country gets to see Bernie Sanders in a very, very different way. And thank you for all the great questions. That's it for now, and I would love to do this again sometime.